The climate is changing. Oceans are warming. Extreme weather is more common. Threatened species are under strain. Whether we accept it or not, it's happening. What we might do about it is up to us. We're on borrowed time.
I'm Andrew Murphy of the Mill Valley Public Library, recording on behalf of the Borrowed Time series. Joining me by phone is Mark Kurlansky, author of more than a dozen books, including the one we will be discussing today, Salmon, a Fish, the Earth, and the History of Their Common Fate. Thank you for joining.
Hi.
So let's just start with the title of your book. What is the common fate of salmon and the Earth?
Well, basically, everything we're doing wrong with the Earth is killing salmon. And so if we save the Earth, we'll save the salmon. And if we don't save the salmon, we won't save the Earth.
Do you mind painting a picture of what the rivers of Europe and America looked like a few hundred years ago?
Well, a few hundred years ago, they were not without their problems, but they had very large salmon runs, the kind that are only seen in a very few places today, like in Alaska and the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia. But they were, even then, they were struggling with a tendency to block rivers to build dams and overfishing, which actually isn't that much of a problem today. Today we've moved on to much more serious problems, but in those days they were netting too many fish.
In your book, you share that the very river that runs through your hometown was once salmon habitat, though no one remembers it as such. How important do you think it is for people to be aware of the natural habitat of their own backyard and how it's changed in the last 100 or 200 years?
Well, there's a problem that we're not going to be able to restore anything if we don't remember it. And we really, in most cases, don't remember, we don't remember salmon on the Connecticut River. We don't remember the abundance of salmon on the Columbia River. And so what tends to happen in projects that try to restore is what scientists call the problem of shifting baselines. If they can get back to the situation of 1972, they consider it restored, but actually 1972 was a disaster. You have to go back to more like 1772. So, it's only sort of in history and in myth and in anecdotes that we know what we had, which is what we should be trying for.
So with that in mind, the shifting baselines, do you believe that there is such a thing as sustainable fishing today? And if so, what does it look like?
There is sustainable fishing. In fact, there's sustainable salmon fishing. Fishing isn't the problem. If you had a fishery where the only problem was regulating the fishery, that would be wonderful. It'd be so easy. What you have with salmon is you have the problems of deforestation and urban sprawl and bad agricultural practices and damming and climate change and climate change and climate change.
Right. Well, I think when most people think about climate change, they think about how it affects them. They might think about earthquakes and wildfires and rising seas and the things that are most commonly in the news. How will climate change affect salmon more initially rather than way down the road?
Well, to begin with, the salmon cannot live in water that's warmer than 68 degrees. So, the rivers in Alaska were getting dangerously warm last summer. So that's one problem. But an even larger problem is that carbon dioxide loves water. So about a third of the carbon dioxide that's produced on land ends up in the ocean. And it affects the hydrogen content of the ocean, which affects the ability of things to grow, things like zooplankton and capelin and the small things that big fish eat. And so the ocean is losing what's called its carrying capacity. It's losing its ability to feed the animals that live in it. This is the scariest thing I've ever heard of. If oceans can no longer feed the things that live in it, we're really sunk. So you have, for example, the Atlantic salmon. There's very little commercial fishing of Atlantic salmon anymore. And yet, the number of returns for most Atlantic rivers keeps going down. And the reason for that is they're going out to sea, they're not getting enough to eat, they're not getting enough nutrition, and they're not making it back. This is a huge calamity.
Right. And even on top of climate change, when they're going out to sea, they're also competing with hatchery fish, right?
Well, yeah, I don't know that I'd put it like that. I mean, hatchery, the problem with hatchery fish is that they don't compete with wild fish. They're not as good as wild fish. So the problem is that we tend to make up for the loss of wild fish by putting out more hatchery fish, and these fish aren't as good.
I saw an interview with you discussing your book, The Last Fish Tale, in which you coined a term, sociodiversity, and it was in the context of preserving the culture of commercial fishing. And I'm curious how the culture shaped by the lifestyle of fishermen can be preserved without also radically changing the fishing practices of today.
Yeah, well, I mean, salmon isn't the right fish to talk about this with, because really, commercial salmon fishing is being, greatly reduced, and it's not because of bad practices; it's because of the lack of salmon. Fishermen really aren't the problem in this story.
You're also a bit of a food historian and have authored books addressing the shift from regionalized farming to industrialized agriculture. And even your books on cod and salmon have plenty of recipes. So I'd kind of like to ask a couple questions about salmon that loosely fall under the context of salmon as a source of food. You've noted fishermen and fish merchants are certainly aware of best practices for fishing out of concerns of overfishing. And dam operators are certainly aware of how the dam affects this fish. So I'm kind of curious if you think that the only people that are part of the human-fish interaction that are unaware of that the fish are in the trouble are the consumers of the fish at the store and restaurants.
Oh, really?
Oh, I'm asking.
I think they're aware of it also. I think most people don't understand that most wild salmon in the store is from a sustainable fishery. Salmon is actually a very easy fish to regulate because it has a very prescribed life cycle, and we know where they are and what they're doing at any given time. The problem, don't worry about eating the fish. Worry about driving your car. Worry about carbon emissions. People don't realize, some guy who's in the Midwest driving a gas-guzzling SUV is hurting fish in the ocean. Probably more the Atlantic, given the prevailing winds. But the overuse of energy and bad energy is hurting fish, and bad agricultural practices, and building houses on riverbanks, and lots of things that we do. Mm-hmm. Don't worry about eating them.
Okay. If this is what people should focus on, how do you think getting the driver in the Midwest to think about that issue in the context of salmon? Or what about salmon is going to motivate the person in the Midwest from driving their car less?
Or driving a better car.
Or that.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the fact that you're driving this SUV in Indiana and you're killing fish in the North Atlantic, and that's only one of the things you're doing, but just thinking about that really illustrates how serious a problem this is. You know, we have to take it seriously. We have to do something about it, and we have to rise above the level of the current president of the United States and take action.
Are you hopeful that that's happening or will happen? I mean, in the context of our current president, he's rolling back all of
Well, he's hopeless, but states are taking action. Yeah, there's a lot of states that are, just defying the federal government and trying to do things. They're not doing enough because it's being made very difficult for them. But states are committed. Where are you?
Oh, I'm in California.
Yeah, well, California is not sitting around and waiting for Trump to deal with it. They're trying to deal with it. Most states are. I mean, I think the message has gotten out there that this is a serious problem. On the other hand, what I've been thinking about recently is how mobilized people are to protect themselves from this virus.
Mm-hmm.
And, climate change in the long run is going to do more harm than this virus. It's going to upturn our lives far more. It's a far greater problem. And I wonder why we have failed to get people as concerned about that as we have. I mean, think of everybody just staying in their homes and shutting down their lives to deal with this virus. But they won't use better energy or less energy to deal with the climate change. I think it's because one is a problem that's going to face you today, and the other is a problem that's going to face you actually quite soon, but 20 or 30 years.
Right. I think it's my opinion too that just because it's right in front of your face, you can see it. And I guess that's kind of why I was asking about the person in the Midwest in Indiana concerned about salmon, and why would he care about salmon if he can't see it?
Well, you have to think biologically about what it means if the oceans cannot feed the animals that live in it. That means the planet is dying. So it's far beyond whether you get to eat a salmon or not.
I'd like to try something that I hope will be fun for you. I don't know why.
Good, I tell you, I haven't had any fun all week.
Well, this might not be fun either, but I hope it is. I don't know why, but as soon as I finished your book, I immediately opened your other book, Nonviolence. And it must have been just because I just went from book 1 to book 2. But just jumping from that and looking at the 25 lessons from the book, I couldn't help but think about them in the context of salmon. So if you don't mind, I'd like to read some of the lessons and just ask if you think they apply to salmon, and if so, how.
Okay.
So number 21 from your book, Nonviolence. Once you start the business of killing, you just get deeper and deeper without limits.
Um, well, that was true of salmon at one time. Salmon was extremely wasteful, and when they first started coming up with hatcheries, they had this idea that it's no problem, we'll just make some more. But they've learned that it doesn't work that way, and I don't think most people have that mindset anymore. Fortunately, that's a very old-fashioned mindset in terms of fish. Certainly, fishermen don't have that mindset.
What about number 11? The longer a war lasts, the less popular it becomes.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I know people get tired of people like me telling them they have to do something about climate change. But too bad. That's what we've got to do. We do have to do something about it.
Okay. Number 10, the problem lies not in the nature of man, but in the nature of power.
Yeah. Or more specifically, in this particular case, it has to do with the nature, the whole concept of economic development. When I was tracing the history of this whole thing, and I looked at Britain and the Industrial Revolution and how they put up all these dams to power factories, and then the factories polluted while the dams blocked the river, and pretty soon the rivers were all dead. And then British people who had moved to New England did the exact same thing in New England. And then it was actually mostly New Englanders who went to the Pacific Northwest and built an economy there by producing a huge amount of electrical power.
Mm-hmm.
And, doing this by killing the rivers, by blocking them with dams. And so I was thinking, why don't people learn anything? And then I realized that it's because they're not trying to learn anything. The people who destroyed the rivers in Britain considered it a tremendous success. They made Britain the most important industrial power in the world. And the people who did that in New England made New England the most important industrial power in North America. And they took relatively unproductive Pacific Northwest and turned it into a huge economic powerhouse by producing more electricity than anybody else in the world has. So these are success stories. So that's what's wrong with us, is the success. It's our whole notion of economic development that has to change. The giveaway here is that in times of economic recession, like right now, carbon emissions are way down. But in times of so-called prosperity, carbon emissions are way up. So boosting the economy means destroying the planet. Now, there is this political argument that gets out there saying that, well, you can't do all this environmental stuff because you have to have jobs. But that's a completely false argument. Jobs do not have to be destructive. Economic development does not have to be destructive. We have to learn other ways of doing it.
Yeah, actually, just this morning I was reading an article about the Green New Deal, but it was also, mostly about the New Deal after the 1929 depression or stock market crash. And I was surprised that there was a congressman in the early 30s acknowledging very publicly that Americans have caused more damage to the earth than any group in history. It just really surprised me that somebody was a congressman was saying that 80 years ago, and how the narrative has changed so much in that time to even deny that we've done that.
Yeah. And I mean, what's really sort of shocking to me was to realize how celebrated the destruction of the Columbia River was. Woody Guthrie sang a song about it. This was the New Deal, and this is what they were doing. They were creating jobs and bolstering the economy, and only a very few people were saying, yeah, but you're wrecking everything.
Well, that's a good segue into lesson number 22. Violence always comes with a supposedly rational explanation, which is only dismissed as irrational if the violence fails. You don't have to comment on that. I had some other prepared questions.
That's because they think it's going to work,
Yeah.
Just like, these disastrous economic programs, they imagine they'll work, and maybe they work in the short run, but they don't in the long run. I mean, an extreme example is Trump thinking that he can, develop the coal industry. That's a disaster. It's an absolute disaster. So you don't say, you don't go to West Virginia and tell coal miners, we're going to just keep this coal industry going because, we want to protect your job. What you have to say to them is we have to find new kinds of jobs for you doing something else that isn't destructive.
Do you think this current time during the pandemic and possible recession is a opportunity for that change to happen?
It is an opportunity. I mean, whenever, for one reason or another, everything gets torn down and has to be rebuilt, there's always the possibility of building it better. Whether that'll actually happen or not, I can't say. I don't know. I really, I just keep thinking about this every day, about what is this going to lead to, and I just don't know. But you're right. I mean, it's a tremendous opportunity. Now that the economy has completely come apart, it has to be rebuilt. Let's do it better.
So in your epilogue, you note that scientists are coming to the consensus that we are doomed. And, obviously climate change is a very serious thing. And I guess what I would like to ask you is, what motivates you to try? Like, why write this book?
Well, scientists, an increasing number of scientists think we're doomed. And the reason for that is that nobody is listening to them. So, as a writer, that seems to be, what I should be doing is get this listened to.
Perfect. Thank you.
Borrowed Time is a collaborative effort by librarians to combat climate change by discussing sustainability issues and all things related to the human influence on our ecosystem. For more episodes, visit borrowed-time.org.